Once again from the campus of St. Bonaventure High School with Max behind the camera and me in front of the camera, welcome to episode 162 of the OLA Adult Ed Faith Formation Weekly Gospel Podcasts, where you and I get to sit down each week for about 15 or 20 minutes, unpack the Sunday Gospel readings so we have a better understanding of and better appreciation for what the Word of God has for us. This is the year of Matthew. We are continuing to be in the Gospel of Matthew. It is if memory serves correctly, the 15th Sunday of Ordinary Time. And on the 15th Sunday of Ordinary Time, we will be in Matthew 13. And here's a case where the church gives an option: a longer reading and a shorter reading. The longer reading is Matthew 13, verses 1 to 23. The shorter reading is Matthew 13, verses 1 to 9. And as you well know, if you've been watching a few of these, I always opt for the longer version. So that's what we'll do. Matthew 13, verses 1 to 23. 23 verses, but they are divided up into three parts. Verses 1 to 9 is the very famous parable of the sower and the soils. That's verses 1 to 9, is Jesus telling the parable itself, the sower and the soils. Verses 10 to 17, Jesus explains to his disciples why he's teaching in parables. And then verses 18 to 23, Jesus explains the parable he has just taught. So again, verses 1 to 23, 1 to 9 is the parable of the sower and the soils itself. 10 to 17 is Jesus explaining why he teaches in parables overall. And then verses 18 to 23 is an explanation of the parable of the sower and the soils. Now, 23 verses, three separate parts. To go through the entire parable itself, and Jesus' explanation of the parable, and his explanation on why he teaches in parables in general, that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're trying to keep a 15 or 20-minute podcast. In fact, when I do a Bible study on the parable of the sower and the soils, that parable, it takes about an hour to unpack that parable itself. So well beyond the scope of this podcast. So what I decided to do is just talk about that middle part, verses 10 to 17, where Jesus explains to his disciples why he teaches in parables to begin with. Because Matthew 13, we're going to get into a number of parables Jesus teaches. So as we cycle through the chapter 13 of Matthew, and we cycle through all of these parables, it might be good this podcast, as we enter into chapter 13, to just limit ourselves to talking about why he teaches in parables to begin with. Okay? So we're going to just concentrate on that middle portion, verses 10 to 17. So let's pick it up. It says, the disciples approached him, Jesus, and said, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" Now, the them is the crowds. And the disciples ask why he's speaking to them in parables. Now, this question only makes sense if this indicates a shift in Jesus' teaching. Because think about it. If Jesus is teaching in Matthew 13 the same way he did previously, then the disciples wouldn't even be asking this question. So the fact that they ask him the question, "Hey, Jesus, why now are you teaching in parables?" tells us that there's a shift in Jesus' teaching method. And in fact, there is. Up to this point, Jesus engaged in straight teaching, discourses. The prime example, Matthew 5, 6, 7, the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 13, now we do see a shift in his teaching methodology. He goes from straight teaching, discourses, to teaching in parables. The disciples notice this shift, and they ask Jesus, "How come?" So that's kind of what's behind the question that leads off the verses we're going to look at in this podcast. The disciples approached him, Jesus, and said, "Why do you speak to them, the crowds, in parables?" Fair question, because like I said, this represents a shift in his teaching methodology, a shift in his teaching technique. Now, we might expect Jesus to give a fairly straightforward answer. Disciples ask him, hey, Jesus, why are you teaching them in parables now? And we would expect Jesus to say, oh, because, and give them a straightforward answer. But how often have we seen the disciples ask Jesus a question, and rather than Jesus giving them a straightforward answer, he gives them what appears to us, what appears to our ears, as a very long-winded, convoluted answer that doesn't seem to answer the question at all. We see that any number of times with Jesus, and this is another case of it. So let's take a look at what Jesus' response is, and that'll launch us into the unpacking. Again, let's pose the question. Jesus approached him and said, why do you speak to them in parables? There's the question. Next verse, Jesus' response. He said in reply, and here is the seemingly long-winded, convoluted answer that doesn't seem to be an answer, okay? He said to them in reply, because knowledge of the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven has been granted to you, he's talking to his disciples, but to them it has not been granted. To anyone who has, more will be given, and he will grow rich. From anyone who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because they look but do not see, and hear but do not listen or understand. Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them, which says, you shall indeed hear but not understand, you shall indeed look but never see. Gross is the heart of this people. They will hardly hear with their ears. They will have closed their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and be converted, and I shall heal them. That's Jesus' reply to the disciples' very simple, very straightforward question, why are you shifting now to teaching them in parables? So if you're one of the disciples and you ask this question and you hear Jesus' response and you hear what I just read Jesus say, you've got to be scratching your head. You've got to be going, okay, Jesus, I'm sure there's an answer to our question in there somewhere, but we can't see it. So how exactly, all due respect, right? How exactly does your reply answer our question of why you've shifted from straightforward discourses to parables, okay? That's what we have to unpack. That's really the purpose of this particular podcast. Now, before we get into the unpacking, let me pose a question here, okay? And the question is this. If you were to ask anybody else, or if you were to ask yourself, hey, why did Jesus teach in parables? The very common answer you would hear if you just said to somebody else, hey, can you explain to me why Jesus taught in parables? More often than not, the answer you would probably get is, oh, because a parable is a nice story. It's easy to understand. It's simple to understand. They were simple people. So he was kind of presenting the truths in a very simple, easy to understand fashion. And he was doing it in a story so they can relate to it. More often than not, that's the answer that you'll get when you ask somebody why Jesus taught in parables. And on one level, there's a truth to that, okay? He did. One of the reasons he did teach in parables is because if you look at a lot of the parables, they were drawn from situations and circumstances that the people lived in every single day and that they can relate to. Because a parable, the word parable comes from the word parabolo, which means to lay something aside of, to lay something next to. And what a parable does is it puts forth kind of an earthly story and lays next to it, lays aside of it, a spiritual lesson, okay? So that's what parables do. And, one of the ways to impart that spiritual lesson is through, wrapping it in a story that the people can readily understand because they live it out every single day. On one level, that's true. But there's a much deeper level why Jesus shifted at this point to teaching in parables. And it's the deeper level that Jesus gets to in this seemingly long-winded response that doesn't sound like a response at all, okay? Because he talks about, he says, this is why I speak to them in parables, right? Because they look but do not see, they hear but do not listen or understand. And when he says that, Jesus is saying, I teach to them, because again, this sounds counterintuitive. It doesn't sound, to our ears, it doesn't sound like an answer. Jesus, why do you teach to them in parables? I teach to them in parables because they listen but don't hear, they see but they don't understand. So because they listen and don't hear, because they see and they don't understand, that's why you teach them in parables? That seems weird. But what Jesus is saying by saying this is he's quoting a prophecy from Isaiah, okay? Now, in order to get to the context of the prophecy Jesus quotes from Isaiah, the part from Isaiah he's quoting in is Isaiah's commissioning to be a prophet, right? Because if we go to Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah has a vision. He sees God sitting on the throne, and he sees seraphim surrounding him, right? And they're singing, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And Isaiah sees this and sees how holy God is, and then looks at himself and he says, woe is me. I'm a man of unclean lips. I'm a sinner, right? And at that point, one of the angels touches Isaiah's lips with a burning coal, and it purges him, right? And then God says, well, who shall I send to my people? And Isaiah says, here I am, Lord, send me. So at that point, God commissions Isaiah as a prophet. But he drops kind of a bomb on Isaiah. It's as if to say, he says, okay, Isaiah, I've asked, who shall I send? You've said, send me. I'm going to send you. And here is your message. I want you to preach to these people. These people that are hard-hearted, that are stiff-necked, right? That the prophets are telling them stuff and they're not seeing it. They're not hearing it. They're not understanding it. And therefore, they're not changing their ways. They're continuing to be hard-hearted and stiff-necked, and they're continuing to be disobedient. So Isaiah, I want you to send, the message I want you to send them, okay, is I want you to preach, all right? And I want you to preach in kind of parable-like fashion, right? To separate out those that will accept the message and those that won't. And Isaiah, when you preach the message in kind of parable-like fashion, okay, there are going to be people that are going to listen to you but not take it in. There's going to be people that see you and not realize what you're doing. There's going to be people that just will not understand but continue preaching, all right? So that is the message he gave to Isaiah, God gave to Isaiah back then, okay? Preach the message, preach it in parable-like fashion, knowing and realizing some people will accept it, some people will reject it, but keep preaching, right? Now, Jesus in Matthew 13 is doing that same thing, right? He's preaching the gospel, right? He's trying to build the kingdom, all right? He's now using parables, and he is indicating to his disciples that there are going to be some people that hear the message and accept it, some people that don't. Because here's the key, okay? Yes, a parable is in story form, right? It's a spiritual message within an earthly kind of message or setting, right? But the key with the parable is you have to make an effort to understand it. Because in a parable, because this isn't necessarily an introduction to parables class, obviously, but in a parable, at some point in the parable, there's always a twist. There's always something unexpected, okay? And when the parable gets to that twist, that gets to that unexpected part, that's where the person has to choose to really engage his intellect and try and figure out what Jesus is saying, okay? Now, granted, engaging your intellect to try and figure out what the twist of the parable is, and therefore where the message of the parable lies, okay? Bringing your intellect to grips, to terms with that takes effort. That takes thought. That takes a desire and a willingness to do it. That takes an open heart. That takes an open mind. It takes a docile, teachable spirit. And those people that possess those things will dive in, will seek to understand the meaning and message of the parable that's hidden in the twist, and that will therefore understand the parable. But the people that are, Jesus, when you gave me a straight teaching, you were straightforward. I listened and I understood. But now you're teaching in a way where now I gotta put some effort into understanding this. I gotta bring my intellect to bear on this. I've got to, in order to do that, I've got to have an open heart and an open mind and a docile, teachable spirit. But there's going to be some people that say, well, no, thanks. If that's what it takes to understand these parables, no thanks. That's too much effort. I'm not willing to put that kind of effort in, okay? If I can just sit back and just understand it passively, that's great. But if I have to dig in and figure out what you're trying to tell me, all right? Hey, that's going to take effort. That's going to take energy. That's going to take time. And I don't have a heart for that. I don't want to put my heart into it at that level. I don't want to open up our mind at that level. I don't want to have a teachable spirit to that level. Well, if for the people that approach parables in that fashion, they wouldn't understand. They'd still see Jesus teaching in parables. They'd still hear him, but they would be like Isaiah prophesied people would be like. They would see. All right? They would have eyes but not see. They would be looking at Jesus, talking in parables, but they wouldn't see the message. They would have ears but wouldn't hear. They would hear what he's saying, but they would listen to what he's saying, but they wouldn't hear and understand what he's saying because they didn't have that open mind, that open heart, that docile, teachable spirit, right? They weren't willing to put in the time and the effort. Jesus indicated in other parts of Scripture, I have come not to bring peace, but to bring division. And this is one form that's going to cause that division. Jesus now is kind of separating people into two groups. He shifted into a teaching method where in order to understand what he's teaching, you have to bring a certain thing to it, right? You have to be willing to put in the energy, the time, the effort. You have to have an open mind, an open heart, a teachable spirit, all right, to understand what he's teaching, because if you don't, you won't. And it's that in that regard where he says that parables will reveal the mysteries of the kingdom to some people, and they will conceal the mysteries of the kingdom to others. The people that want to put the time, effort, energy, that have the open mind, open heart, teachable spirit, The parables will reveal the mysteries of the kingdom. They will reveal the truths of the kingdom, all right? But those people that don't want to put in the time, effort, energy, that don't approach it with an open heart, open mind, teachable spirit, well, then the parables, they'll conceal them. It's not that the parables will conceal them, but the manner in which they approach them will prevent the parables from revealing it to them. So therefore, the mysteries and the secrets will be concealed to them. Okay? So that's what Jesus is basically getting at when the disciple says, hey, why are you shifting from straightforward teaching to parables? And Jesus quotes Isaiah, okay, that, there's going to be, when you shift to parables, some people are going to understand them, some people won't, some people will accept them, some people won't. Now Jesus has shifted in teaching in parables, and he's basically telling his disciples what Isaiah prophesied would happen when the people were approached with parables is actually happening. Okay? It's kind of separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, right? And when he says, those that have more will be given more, those that really seek to understand the truths of the kingdom, that really seek to unpack the message of these parables, okay, their understanding will grow. It'll richen. It'll deepen. But those people that it's too much effort, too much time, I don't want to bother, then what little understanding they have will be even less, because not only will they not grow in their understanding, their inability to understand, or their willingness to understand, could possibly lead into a lack of wanting to understand. So they close their hearts to that. That's what Jesus is getting when, after teaching the parable of the sower and the soils, the disciples ask why the shift. Jesus gives an answer that at the outset doesn't seem like an answer. It seems long-winded and convoluted, like we said. But if I've done at least a halfway decent job of unpacking this, which I hope I have, Jesus' answer is, in fact, an answer. Okay? He shifted so that people have to really determine, do I want to put the time, the effort, the energy into this thing, into following him and understanding his messages? Do I have a heart that's open enough? Do I have a mind that's open enough? Do I have a spirit that's teachable enough to understand these messages? He's getting each person to answer that question for themselves before they go any further. So that's verses 10 to 7. That is the portion of the 23 verses we kind of unpacked in this gospel podcast. And even with this, Max has put the counter in front of me. It's the 23-minute mark, so you can see where we couldn't have done the entire 23 verses. So hopefully when you get to, if you do have the long version of the reading, which includes Jesus' explanation of why he teaches in parables, when you get to verses 10 to 17, when you hear this gospel proclaimed, you'll understand why the disciples asked this question in the first place and how seemingly a non-answer is actually an answer. So, and again, hopefully I've done a halfway decent job of explaining this. But you'll be the judge of that. So in the meantime, at the 24-minute mark, I will bring this rather lengthy podcast to a close by again saying, until we meet next week for episode 163, with Max behind the camera, and us on the campus of St. Bonaventure High School, take care and God bless.